Hello, students. I'm back like a bad penny. Uh, but today we're going to spend some time talking about child welfare and housing policy. Um, I spent a good portion of my career in child welfare, specifically in child protection, about 18 years or more or less. And so it's a complex set of issues, it's oftentimes controversial. And then housing is another huge barrier that had an impact on child welfare that we had to grapple through. And so I'll just spend a little time today just kind of giving you some of the highlights of looking at child welfare policies and then at housing policies. All right, so when we go back in history, we'll find that Child Protective Services, foster care, adoption, Head Start were all the focus of child welfare policy since the 1960s. So it's not been around. Um, and so for those who um, were not born or were born prior to the 60s, there was actually a time that you were a part of a society that didn't have succinct child protection and child welfare laws. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon in U.S. history, but it's needed and it's been met with some controversy. Um, Part of the issue is that the second bullet, which talks about the United States government, just has not established a family policy that ensures basic income, employment, social service support for parents, and then they have difficulty caring for their kids, which in turn turns up the need for an involvement of the outside authorities in terms of the child welfare system. So again, a lot of these things that we see, a lot of things that I saw over the 18 years were pretty much directly related to um, lack of income or just basic poverty, and kids were neglected, not because parents wanted to neglect them, but they just were in financial situations for any variety of reasons that caused them to not be in a position to care for their kids. So again, some of that can be alleviated by addressing that. And then one fifth of the children live in poverty, and another third have lack of access to health care. So this just continues to compound the problem. When we think about child welfare policy and we think about how we ranked among the developed nations in our country here, we rank 20th in well-being of all developing nations. And so it's really it's problematic. And I think that we can learn something from the Netherlands, and that they're number one. Kids don't grow up in poverty. Uh, there are more lenient healthcare laws, as well as there are built-in systems that actually give parents much more support and keep them from slipping into poverty. So again, something to be learned. Again, the Social Security Act of 1935, addressed child welfare through the Aid to Dependent Children. So that has morphed to TANF and a number of different other programs over time, and it's still there. So as you can see, 1935 Social Security Act was a key piece of legislation around social welfare, and it's kind of the cornerstone. In 1974, CAPTA, the Child Abuse and Prevention Act, really kind of kicked the ball into high gear as it defined child abuse. It looked at investigative methods, created standards, looking at protecting people um, and immunity in terms of reporting those particular cases. So it's a pretty key piece of legislation that kind of moved us to where we need to go today. Because before then, and it only came to the attention of physicians who were seeing an unprecedented number of children showing up in emergency rooms and in hospitals with just unexplained injuries. And so they lobbied with Congress and government folks to actually put this act into place so that they can have a little bit more influence in terms of trying to stop the tide of what was happening for children in our countries. Continued child welfare policy includes foster care, and these are services for victims of child abuse, neglect, or parental absenteeism, where someone has to be responsible for kids. And if the system has to move them into a foster care setting until they can return kids back home, that's the ideal piece. Um, Child Welfare Act of 1980 then kind of moved things even further along in terms of developing of treatment plans and permanency planning, that we couldn't have kids in foster care for years and years and years. while parents were working on the issues that they needed to fix. And then treatment plans with clear, objective goals and governmental resources to get people, parents, the help that they need so that they could parent their kids in a successful way and have them return home. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 gave tribes primary jurisdiction, um, in terms of setting a standard for active effort. So when children of Native American heritage are actually who are enrolled in tribes, are actually a subject of the child protection system, the tribe has the ultimate jurisdiction. And that grows out of the fact that for many, many years prior to this act, Native American children were taken out of their homes, placed into other homes that didn't respect, know, understand their culture, and a lot of children died, under the care of others. And so, given the genocide that the Native Americans had already experienced, this was a, a governmental measure to really look at how do we preserve the sovereignty, and the importance and the legacy of Native American families. And so we have the Child Welfare Act of 1978. Adoptions are this process that give permanent families to kids when they're unable to reunify with their parents or their parental rights have been terminated. Foster care provides this alternative care for parents who are not able to take care of kids. More recently, we've started to license relatives to do foster care so kids can still have a cultural connection to their actual home. And then Head Start in 1964 really looked at starting to have an early preschool experience for kids, offering health screening, socialization experiences, and dental pieces. So that kids could get off to just what they say, a healthy head start. And then there's some more recent issues in the last 10, 15, 20 years around daycare, maternal and child, infant mental health, as well as health, and then teen pregnancies are compounding the issues as it relates to child welfare as well. So switching gears, we're going to talk a little bit about the housing policy. And so we recognize that housing comes at a premium, and affordable housing is problematic. And so the problem persists because the places are just not affordable. And there's a large inventory of dilapidated and dangerous housing, and then there are increasingly higher numbers of people moving to homelessness, which is problematic for the number one country in the world. The housing crisis also, I think, is a structural problem based on the failure of incomes to keep pace with housing costs. And so that's an issue around corporations and capitalist America in terms of looking at having employers and corporations to pay people a livable wage so that they could actually afford the housing. So again, very complicated issues. Um, Overdependence on credit to build houses. There are profit-making systems that drive home ownership and development and management. Um, and the U.S., has to address these cost burdens of overcrowding and housing quality, as well as discriminatory practices. So on top of the issues that we just talked about, there are also other issues around lenders and banks and mortgage companies just not approving the applications of many people who are minority status or from a marginalized and oppressed group. So again, problematic things that just kind of continue to compound the issues. And then the average American spends about 34% of their income on housing annually. So these are just kind of a snippet of some of the housing policies that kind of came into place. So from 37 to 49 to 1954, all the way up until 1977 in present day, have been addressing this issue around um, housing, adequate housing, safe housing, money for housing, developing neighborhoods, um, mortgage companies being able to disclose the tenants of where they're actually buying homes to make sure that they were not redlining and creating these poverty-stricken neighborhoods, as well as just disclosure. So there are acts and policies that are in place that have been in place for a while to try to rectify some of the housing programs, but yet it still persists. This is basically a snapshot of some of the legislation and policy things that have been taken up since 1937 up through at least 2013 as it relates to housing. and affordable housing. More policy pieces around National Housing Act, soil conservation, um, National Youth Administration. So there are a lot of different policies that impact housing. Even the Fair Labor Standards Act, which talks about the minimum wage. So it's all tied together in terms of what we need to be doing, as well as their regulations for banking, in terms of how they actually administer and create and make decisions about loans and properties. So some of the issues that we're dealing with as it relates to housing policies is that you still got a percentage of renters that are paying more than half their income for rent. So that's problematic on a couple of areas. We also look at the disparity in terms of home ownership, and 43% of blacks and Hispanics own homes compared to 71% of whites. And so there are systemic issues around loans and processes that play into that maybe even racist on their face in terms of that. Homes are becoming more unaffordable because they're larger and more expensive. Uh, Everybody's paying more for housing, and then the subprime loans that really are targeting low income buyers who often maybe have the worst credit. They're actually hit with higher interest rates, so they're paying more for the same house as someone who would actually have a better credit rating, which is problematic. And then a lack of affordable renting housing, and then gentrification, this whole notion of moving into neighborhoods that often housed communities of color, people who were maybe on a lower socioeconomic scale, the aged, buying those particular condos, and then these younger white collar professionals moving in and displacing those folks who are poor, and changing the face of neighborhoods and pricing people who lived in the neighborhood actually out of the neighborhood. This is a snapshot that really looks at the poverty household, low wage workers, low income, and then moderate. So these are some of the jobs that people have, and of course, as you know, it's based on education and how well you do. And so these are things that we need to be mindful of in terms of looking at policy as it relates to pay, so that people can actually be in position where they can afford to actually buy homes and not be homeless. Um, Other issues as it relates to housing policy is, we've got overcrowding, we've got older homes with lead paint that needs to be abated, we've got a property tax issue that's used to fund school and other different services, homelessness in and of itself, in terms of the numbers having drastically increased. Also recognizing that there is some efforts at housing reforms that are, the 1995 National Low Income Housing Coalition really is looking at working with the number of things that are here under this particular bullet as it relates to fair housing laws, making things affordable, and looking out for the lower income folks, as well as trying to not taking on racial segregation in terms of neighborhoods. So a ton of issues, as you can see, in terms of, you know, even the subsidizing of this particular segregation. This has happened a long time ago. So the reason that there are neighborhoods in most cities that are, um, let's say, substandard as opposed to high quality neighborhoods is kind of a design piece that our own government, through its legislation, kind of played a role in terms of legalizing by not providing FHA loans to those who actually could afford them, or when they were approved, they were steered to neighborhoods that were redlined. So again, it's a complex issue that has some history, roots in history. And then we have this growing phenomenon of homelessness. And so as we take a look at this particular page, and it's coming from 1984, this is what's happening in our very own state. So older adults, 55 plus, 10% of them are homeless. Adults between 25 and 54 make up the largest percentage. 32% are children age 17 with parents, and then unaccompanied minors make up 15% of the people who can't afford to live anywhere. And so when we take a look at these particular issues, we recognize that the piece around homes and housing policy is crucial if we're going to ever kind of reach our full potential of being the greatest country in the world. While we might have that title in terms of economics and power, you know, it would probably be much more transcendent if we can do the same kind of things as it relates to the people who actually make this country and making sure that they have an affordable, reasonable, and safe place to live.